Something that goes hand in hand with the physical security is the environmental security. And lots of folks don't really think about that so much. But when you're looking at security, you're not just looking at locked doors, you're also looking at how good is the environment? Is it too dusty? Is it too hot? Is it too humid? Is the equipment exposed to the weather or just to the environment itself? So let's talk about power issues and failures, and water damage and flooding and fires and structural damage. Power issues happen all the time. I have been in towns where like a bunch of installations, because the power grid wasn't very good, one good lightning strike actually blew up machines in a bunch of installations. If you actually put a meter on an outlet, and the kind that actually slowly prints the paper very, very slowly, and you look over a 24-hour period, you'll be amazed at how much the power can vary. There can be 30,000 volt spikes, but they're so short that they don't really cause much damage. When we're looking at environmental, we're looking at, okay, what are you doing about it? So like when I was working in Africa, the power was actually not very good. And so what we, as a standard course did, we made sure that all machines had a uninterruptible power supply, a UPS, that went along with the machine. Now, of course, how long do the batteries last? 2 years, 3 years, maybe. And so you've got these machines out in the field and the UPS doesn't work, so they just bypass it. Well, okay, now we are not protecting from the environmental issues. We're not protecting from power. Or we don't have good surge protectors. One good lightning strike and it can take out the power supply or even the motherboard of a computer. Power goes down all the time, yeah. And if you're in the middle of writing to a database and the power goes off and you don't have a UPS to provide a little bit of battery power, just long enough for the OS to finish up and shut down nicely, then we've got corrupt data as well. So this sort of thing happens all the time. And talking about water damage and flooding, you know, a few years ago, of course, we had a terrible hurricane called Katrina in the US. And there were so many hospitals that kept their records down in the basement, and those records are gone. You know, so what do we do about this? Not too long ago, we basically had Wall Street go dark because even the subways were flooded. I mean, I remember looking at pictures and thinking, oh my goodness, I was just there standing on that platform just a couple months ago. And so, yeah, water damage and flooding, that can happen. And maybe if you're not in a floodplain, maybe if you're not in an area that's at risk to hurricanes and tidal waves and whatever, you could still have sprinkler systems go off and flood things. So you have to be aware of all of this risk. Ultimately, what do you do? If you're in a high-risk area, the bottom line is, what are you doing to protect the data? And usually the thing is, you've got off-site copies that are either being taken off-site on a regular basis or are being sent by a database, log shipping to another database or something. You've got another mirrored site. So if you're going to be in locations where there are environmental potential disasters, you got to make sure that the data is elsewhere. I remember working for a Fortune 100 company. I was there, a financial firm, and there were some environmental disasters there, and fortunately they had so much, their data was spread out with fault-tolerant copies in other locations and standby sites that they were able to weather that, even though Wall Street went completely dark for a few days. So just see what people are doing to protect their data. Ultimately, it comes down to having accessible copies somewhere else, and not just the data. If they use certain tape machines to back up, and yeah, maybe you've got the tapes, but can you get those same tape machines? It's easy to get a server. If you've got a service contract with Dell or HP, you can get a server in a couple of hours. That's not hard. The hard part is, do those tape drives exist anymore? And you were striping 5 of them together. Can you get 5 of them now? So it's not only the data, but how do you access the data? And not only that, you should see if they are restoring their data on trial basis. I've seen plenty of cases where people were backing up, backing up every day, swapping out the tapes. The night person was swapping the tapes, da-da-da-da. But they never bothered to do a test restore, and they never noticed those slight little tiny warnings in the backup log that actually said backup failed, and never noticed that. So you got to really be looking at the environmental thing, and since environmental can be such a big thing, what are you ultimately doing to protect the data and being able to access the data if there is an environmental disaster? So not just the water damage and the flooding, not just the power failures, but also fires, and I got to say this too, heat and dust. You know, when I was working in Africa, dust was terrible, and we knew that. So we never bought anything too expensive because we knew that we couldn't maintain clean enough environments. That's fine, but we always protected the data. And the way we protected the data was such that we could restore the data in different locations. And for people's workstations, we knew that they were going to die because of heat and dust. So we provided a UPS, and we just knew that we would have to recycle the workstations and replace parts on a regular basis. Also, not only that, but there's the structural damage too. I mean, my native state, California, we're in earthquake country. If you live along the whole Pacific Rim, if you're in Japan or whatever, you can, it's Alaska, you can be susceptible to earthquakes, which means you'll have structural damage, which means that maybe the building is too unsafe to come back into to retrieve your data, or the equipment has been completely destroyed by the building falling down around it. So these are all environmental risks. Are we close to a source of water? Are we close to an airport where there could be some disaster? Are we close to anything where there could be a disaster? Are we really close to a train track even? Are we close to a major intersection where someone could drive a car through a front plate glass window? Don't laugh, I've seen that happen, where cars actually got out of control, barreled right through the reception area, barreled through a wall, and came actually into a manager's office, and wiping out computers along the way. So be aware of all of these things, and hey, if it's the risk we take, then okay, what's your contingency? If it's a residual risk, then how do you deal with losing your data in case of a catastrophe? These are the things the IS auditor is looking for. So with the power issues, of course, we got to make sure that, remember, power issues affect the security systems and the network infrastructure as well. You know, so like power goes off, everybody's UPS is still running, but then we just go, oh, we didn't put the router and the switches on a UPS. Well, that's fine because the ISP's system is down anyway. We can't communicate out anyway. So you have to be thinking of anything with an on-off button that plugs in. It's got to have some kind of contingency for power as well. Now, different types of power issues. You can have blackout where like no power, or brownout or a sag where the voltage drops really low, too low for the systems to function properly. That's where your UPS kicks in, right? Or a sag where it's momentarily drops down, or a spike, which, you know, 30,000 volt short transient on a power line blows away your motherboard and your power supply and gets past the surge protector. You got to realize that surge protectors are only designed for so much power going through them. This is where a UPS, actually even a cheap UPS, works really well, because you're actually feeding the machine off the battery and not the battery just in standby mode. So we can have surges, of course. We can have spikes, a surge when you have a more prolonged spike, or when a device is started, when we turn on something. Have you ever noticed when you turn on something, the lights dim briefly? That's because it causes a momentary drop. And then when the device is on, then you'll have like this momentary spike or surge. So we want to protect all those with UPSs, alternate power sources, with good surge suppressors, surge protectors, not just power strips. Got to be looking at all those things to protect the equipment and the data that sits on them. So for protecting our power, the generators, the surge protectors, power line monitors, keep an eye on it, UPSs, which basically have the battery and a power converter built in, or additional sources of power. And servers can have multiple power supplies attached to them. For our environmental controls, We can have the heating and the ventilation, the air conditioning, the HVAC systems. Make sure that in the server room that the HVAC is such that it stays cool. Ideally, you should have a relatively cool temperature, and it should be at 50% humidity. So ideally in the high 60s, low 70s, 50% humidity, because if it's too dry, you build up static electricity. Now if it's too wet, then moisture will accumulate. Also, how do we drain stuff? And what kind of piping? I mean, do we have water piping going right along here in the ceiling? I mean, I've been at conferences where heavy rains have started to leak and the water's dripping down on top of all a floor full of live computers. So then they basically just hang up big tarps, and these things are heavy with water. And we'd joke like, oh, if the rope broke, it would just come down in this deluge on top of live computers. So we have to be aware of that. Also the lighting. Realize that lighting will generate heat unless it's a cool type of lighting, and lighting will generate electromagnetic noise as well, so you need to keep your cables away from it. What alarms do we have, and the control panels for the alarms? We want to look at those. We want to look at power to the computer room. If you're going to have a computer room, your power needs are going to be much higher than just your average office. You have to actually get with the electrician to say, we're going to need 60 amps or 100 amps or 200 amps or whatever just to this room alone. And so you need to actually start adding up your power consumption needs, and is it adequate? I've been at plenty of locations where they just ran extension cords and wondered why they kept tripping breakers, or wondered why the surge protector, the breakers on the surge protectors would keep tripping. It's because we didn't calculate the amount of power consumption. And also, where is the computer room located, and what fire prevention and detection do we have? In a computer room, you're not going to have sprinkler system. You're going to have some kind of oxygen displacement system. In the old days, we used halon. Now we have halon substitutes that basically will just, if the fire detector notices the fire, it will set off a system that basically expands out gas really quickly from a tank and displaces all the oxygen. Now, I've been at locations where they did that. It sounds like a hurricane in the next room. You probably don't want to be in there because the gas will be something you can't breathe. But anyway, what do we have to suppress fire in a computer room? So when we're looking at environmental controls, we want to make sure the computer room, we want to check it for the presence of water, for the presence of dust, for the heat levels, the temperature levels. Make sure that we've got the smoke detectors, and make sure, of course, we have fire extinguishers. With electrical equipment, you never use a water-based extinguisher. You always use something that is made for electrical equipment. And we want to check the fire suppression systems and detection. Make sure that we have fireproof structures. Sometimes in the ceilings, they'll have fire breaks, basically to help control the fire going through. There'll be doors that are heavy to help control fire going through them. Make sure that we have good surge protection in place, and make sure that the conditions in the room, the humidity, the temperature, etc., are optimal for the machines. So these are all the things we have to look at as an IS auditor when we look at the physical environment and the environmental controls. Next thing we'll talk about is network security devices.